Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. How is the battle raging against the disease of AIDS? What can be done to help slow down or reverse this horrible, horrible disease? My guest today is an expert on this topic. My guest today is Mr. Simon Bland. Mr. Simon Bland is the director of the UNAIDS Office to the United Nations in New York. Mr. Simon Bland, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thanks, Bill. It's great to be here.
I appreciate you being with me. Simon, let's get into it. What exactly is UNAIDS? When was the office formed? What is your major mission?
Okay, Bill. So UNAIDS is shorthand for the Joint United Nations Program on HIV and AIDS. That's a bit of a mouthful, right? It's a bit long-winded, but it's kind of important because I think it signaled an institutional innovation within the UN that recognized we had to do things a little bit differently. And if you think now, cast your mind back to September 2015 when the United Nations adopted the Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2030. I hear people say, you know, this is going to need new ways of thinking, new ways of working, new ways of organizing. And I think, aha, think back to the mid-90s when UNAIDS was created, and that's exactly what the world thought. It thought we have this massive epidemic that threatens the world, a modern day plague, if you like, and we need to catch up and get in front of it. So we need new ways of thinking and new ways of organizing. We need multiple stakeholders, we need multiple sectors to come together in that fight. And so the organization was created to coordinate among the UN and advocate for greater investment, greater intention, greater action to tackle this disease. So we brought together a number of different parts of the UN, what we call co-sponsors, with a small UNAIDS secretariat headquartered in Geneva to do just that.
Mm-hmm. Now your motto is uniting the world against AIDS, and that's one of the ways you're doing it, bringing the stakeholders together. What are some of the other ways you're doing it? It's certainly a group effort. It's something that, a disease that has to be confronted by large parts of societies all around the world. What else are you doing to unite the world?
So it's absolutely a group effort, and one of the things we really found in the formation of this organization was the importance of including people who are infected by or affected by this disease. So civil society plays a huge role in the governance of our organization, played a huge role in advocacy throughout the years. And our partnership straddles much broader than just the UN. I mean, at the dawn of the millennium, new organizations were formed, like the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis and malaria. In this country, the United States, a global leader in the fight against AIDS, they have the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. So we partner and work very closely with these organizations to really unite the world in all its shapes and forms to understand the complexities, the nature, the status of this disease, but also figure out how best to really end it.
Mm-hmm. And of course, our viewers can go to your website, www.unaids.org, right, and get more information. Now, before we go into the AIDS issue, there are some terms, I know these are very basic terms for you, but I think there's some public confusion about, maybe just in my own mind, about, we hear the term HIV and the term AIDS, AIDS. Sometimes they're used together, sometimes they're used interchangeably. What does each mean?
Well, you know, you say we're all really familiar with that, but it becomes part of our language, and sometimes it's good for us to refresh our own memory.
Yes.
HIV is the human immunodeficiency virus. So it's a virus, it's an infection. It's actually what we call an RNA virus that injects a DNA copy of itself into the host cell to replicate. HIV attaches to white blood cells, actually what we call T cells or CD4 cells, and they're the cells that help the body fight infection, the immune system of our body, if you like. And as the virus replicates and grows and the viral load increases, the white blood cells, the T cells, decrease in number. And as they decrease, our immunity becomes compromised. And so that's the virus. There is no vaccine, there is no cure for that virus, but there is therapy, and we can talk about therapy. AIDS is acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, and that really characterizes opportunistic infections that take advantage of that compromised immune system. So infections that the body might usually fight off become much more severe and life-threatening, and several infections can occur at the same time. And so AIDS itself, that syndrome, in the days before therapy, would almost inevitably lead to death.
Mm-hmm. Now, two other terms we've heard quite a bit about, not recently, but years ago, people were saying, well, AIDS is a pandemic. the AIDS virus or the AIDS disease is an epidemic. Which is it? What's the difference between a pandemic and an epidemic?
So, and that's a great question. You can ask lots of different people. If you go to the sort of definitions of an epidemic, it really suggests that it's tracking levels of infections more than one would usually expect. So in a flu season, for example, if you have a lot more than you would usually expect, it's an epidemic. If it's kind of within norms, it's not classed as an epidemic. So it's what one would normally expect to see. If it's more than that, one characterizes as an epidemic. Or one is seeing an infection in parts of the world, geographies that you wouldn't usually see it. So that again is an epidemic. A pandemic simply means an epidemic of global significance and global consequence.
I see. Okay, that certainly clarifies it. Thank you so very much. We were thinking, if we think back to 2000, when the United Nations developed the UN Millennium Development Goals, 8 logical, practical, measurable goals to reduce abject poverty by 50%, to promote universal primary school education, to empower women. I think goal number 6, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, was to either slow down or reverse the AIDS epidemic that we were talking about at that time. How significant was that to focus attention on AIDS, and have we, over that 15-year period from 2000 to 2015, and we'll pick up on the Sustainable Development Goals in 2016 in just a moment, but did we make progress in slowing down AIDS or even reversing it in some areas, and if so, how did we do that?
Well, we definitely made progress. If you think back to the dawn of the millennium, it was a pretty grim period for HIV and AIDS. 1999 statistics showed that we had 5.5 million infections that year, new infections with HIV. We had close to 3 million people dying of AIDS-related deaths in that year. While you talked about there were new therapies and drugs that were available, they were not widely available, and not many people were on treatment at all. So it was a grim time, and we knew that AIDS was severely damaging families, communities, societies. It put back national development by decades. It further widened the gulf between rich and poor. It pushed already vulnerable groups further into the margins of society because of stigma, discrimination, fear, and hopelessness. So it was a pretty dire time. And so having one of those 8 Millennium Development Goals focused on AIDS and some other infectious diseases was absolutely crucial. And the progress was made is quite remarkable. So still no vaccine, still no cure, but treatment much more widely accessible. In 2015, the world celebrated having 15 million people accessing treatment, and that was the target, 15 by 15. So getting that treatment out, we haven't finished, but it was a big part of it. Driving infections down to just over 2 million a year from that 5.5 million a year, and driving deaths down from almost 3 million to 1 million. So it's clear that progress of the disease was halted and to an extent reversed. That progress was made, but it's unfinished.
When we think back to 2000, how have we, you mentioned some of the changes that have transpired over the last several years from 2000 to where we are today. How have we moved forward as far as our attitudes towards AIDS? When we think back to 2000, I think a lot of people were discriminating against people with AIDS. They thought it would only apply to one group or one certain group of people. Today, it's pretty well, I think, accepted that AIDS can apply to anybody, probably on the planet. And so how have we changed our thinking? What have we done to break down some of these psychological barriers, some of these stigmas that were present in 2000 as opposed to today?
Well, stigma and discrimination is unfortunately alive and well in this world. There is still stigma and discrimination around those infected with HIV in different parts of the world. So you can go to some countries and some places and clearly see how people have made progress in their understanding. If I think back to Princess Diana in the UK when she was hugging AIDS patients and just trying to break down that stigma and better understand the nature of transmission. So we have progress, but that progress is patchy. Stigma and discrimination is still there. But we see enlightened places, we see enlightened policies that understand the nature of this disease, the nature of the infection. They understand now that with access to treatment, this no longer needs to be a death sentence. Now, paradoxically, just that very notion led to some changes in behavior in Europe. So when they suddenly realized that it didn't need to be a death sentence, when actually one could access therapy, actually risky behavior, sort of crept back into society. And so we've seen a little bit of an oscillation there. But by and large, I'd say the progress is positive, but by no means have we got to a place where stigma and discrimination are no longer a big part of the challenges that we face.
Mm-hmm. And of course, you mentioned a lot of the medication is available today that was not available in 2000. Do we see that there's more of a public-private partnership between the pharmaceutical companies and governments, between the health industries in the various countries, that they're coming together? Maybe perhaps are the prices coming down on these anti-AIDS drugs and that type of thing? What's helping to fuel this, or is there an increased a raising of the consciousness level around the world of this problem, and some things can be done, especially if the resources are available to do them?
Right. Well, first of all, resources are hugely important, and you think back to the mid-90s when sort of millions, perhaps a couple of $100 million was being invested in the AIDS response, and we're talking about 19 billion now. So resources have made a huge difference. Think back to 1999, that grim picture that I was painting. It was costing around $10,000 per patient per year to access antiretroviral treatment. Now you can get the same access to similar drugs, very effective drugs, depending on quite how you calculate it, but for maybe $100. So we've seen big price declines. Part of that decline in price was not easy. I mean, it took a lot of public advocacy, it took a lot of anger, it took a lot of demonstrations. And then it took some goodwill on both public and private sectors to do that. But this affordability of medicines is an issue that's alive and well today, not only in HIV/AIDS, but if one looks at cancer care, if one looks at sort of new therapies for chronic illnesses, we see cases where costs still remain high. I mean, the President of the United States was meeting with pharmaceuticals yesterday, talking about the price of drugs. The price of drugs continues to be an issue. But what I think we can celebrate is that drugs are now at such a price for antiretrovirals for HIV that there really shouldn't be anything standing out in our way of getting the remaining 18 million people that need treatment today that don't get it onto that treatment.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guests. We would encourage our viewers to go to our website, www.globalconnectionstelevision.com, to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with any type of media outlet, be it a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps it's an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you just have a website and you like our programs and would like to share them with other people, go to the website, download the programs. They are provided free of charge at no cost to help people better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today we're looking at the situation with the AIDS disease that is certainly a major problem, not only basically in most areas of the world in all probability. And my guest is an expert on this. Mr. Simon Bland is the head of the UNAIDS program at the UN in New York. Simon, you're talking about the availability of drugs and that type of thing. And I know every country has a different healthcare system. I probably know two countries, I don't know of them anyway, you may have the same two healthcare systems. Do we see that more and more, like in the UK, for example, the national health system that you have, national health insurance, do they cover some of the AIDS prices, some of the expenses for that? The U.S., some of the other countries are starting to maybe provide more funds to pick up some of these expenses to help offset the costs to buy the drugs. You mentioned $10,000 a year, which could be a pretty heavy hit for a lot of people, a large number of people. Now, some people can afford it very easily, but a large number can't. But do we see that there's more of a move to try to help alleviate some of the financial burden?
So yes, those prices have come down. That $10,000 figure I gave you was back at the dawn of the millennium. Okay. So now it's hundreds of dollars, and that's very affordable for most health systems, and it's really important, isn't it? This was someone who was inevitably going to die from an infection, and now we have treatment that will prolong that life and treat HIV infection as a chronic illness. That's remarkable progress. Our challenge is getting 18 million people on this globe that don't have access to that treatment access right now. So yes, the National Health Service in the UK will cover antiretrovirals. The health system in the US through insurance systems will cover those costs. But we can't end there, and we always face growing challenges of resistance to drugs, and so we need to continue to develop those drugs and new more powerful drugs, in addition to continuing the research and development for a vaccine and a cure. So our message is, with 37 million people on this planet living with HIV and around 18 million people on treatment today, if we can get the next 18 million people on treatment, we break the back of this epidemic. And the good news is every 5 years we have doubled the number of people on treatment globally.
Wonderful.
And so 5 more years, 4 more years, we hope by 2020, we'll pretty much have everybody that needs treatment on treatment. So that's a big challenge. And it's not just treatment, we have to think about prevention as well. But we have those tools, we have that therapy, the costs and affordability is within our grasp. We need this final push. And our strategy talks about 3 90s, 90, 90, 90. It says of the 18 million people that still need treatment today, the vast majority don't know they're HIV positive. So we need testing. So 90% of the people living with HIV need to know they're positive. 90% of those need to access treatment. And 90% of those need to adhere to and stay on that treatment. If we do that, we'll get to an end of AIDS by 2030. Together with the combination prevention and other activities we have to do. But that's a huge opportunity for the world, from that $10,000, that unavailability, that unaffordability, to actually new tools, new therapies, new ways in which we can really break the back of this curse.
It certainly is. Now, is December 1st World AIDS Day? Is that correct?
It is.
Okay.
Right.
All right. Reaching in for the memory
Well done.
bank
Yeah,
on
yeah.
that one. How important is it that the UN General Assembly declared December 1st World AIDS Day, as far as focusing attention, galvanizing support, and that type of thing, to combat this horrific disease?
Well, look, it's hugely important. And there's a couple of things I'd say. I mean, just moving from that MDG period to the SDG period, it's a complex world out there with a lot of priorities. What we know is that when we have strong political leadership and political commitment, together with finances and tools, we make real progress. And so World AIDS Day is a day where we take stock of the progress that has been made, we re-energize ourselves, we try and communicate effectively and well to let as many people know about the challenges that we face and get that recommitment to invest in, and make it happen.
Now, we talked about the Millennium Development Goals, the 8 Millennium Development Goals from 2000 to 2015, and now the Sustainable Development Goals are built on those from 2016 through 2030. As I recall, number 3 is for good health and well-being.
Right.
I assume that's one of the major goals that you're focusing on. All the rest of them, I'm sure, are important, the other 16, but how are you using that to mobilize people to combat AIDS?
Right. Well, the first thing is I think the SDGs are quite remarkable. For all members of the United Nations, for all countries of this globe, to negotiate over a 2.5-year period under the able leadership of ambassadors from Kenya, Hungary, and Ireland, to come up with Agenda 2030 and an agreement for this framework. Many people said that couldn't be done. Some worried that we went from 8 goals, 3 of which were health, to 17 goals, 1 of which was health, that's sort of diminishing health. I don't believe it is. I think we have an agenda now that is broad in scope, that is comprehensive, that recognizes the interdependence and integration across those goals, and is universal. Bill, you talked about HIV and AIDS being in all parts of the world. It is. It's a universal issue. Development is a universal issue. The MDGs were about north-south and about concessional aid transfers. The SDGs are about the world. 43 countries are going to come to New York in July and report on their implementation of the SDGs. And that's not just developing countries, that's rich, developed countries. So it's universal. That's really important. Within those goals, goal 3 is health, and within that goal, target 3.3 says by 2030, end the epidemic of AIDS. I mean, how ambitious is that? And that's fantastic. To be able to dare to say that is quite audacious. And we feel confident in saying that because we've had Lancet commissions, we've had other research, and even without that vaccine and a cure, with this treatment, with prevention, tackling stigma and discrimination, we know we can break the back of this disease. And so I'm excited and energized by this agenda. We are generous champions of the whole agenda. We don't just focus on AIDS, but we have that clear ambition within the agenda and a roadmap for getting there that I think is deeply exciting.
It certainly is. It seems, and it may just be me, but it seems as though we read much more, and maybe it's because we're making progress in this area, and it's not quite as alarming to some people. It should be, but not quite as alarming. It seems as though we read more about AIDS back in the 90s and the early 2000s as opposed to today. Maybe I'm just missing. I go through 8 newspapers a day and I don't see a lot of articles on AIDS. Am I missing something?
No, you're not, Bill. You're not missing something. And look, a challenge of having an ambitious goal and a narrative that says by 2030 end AIDS. You know, I think at this World AIDS Day we said AIDS isn't over, but it can be. On one hand, that's really exciting. On the other hand, it's a communications challenge because people read that, well, it's kind of done. It's kind of finished. But the last mile, finishing jobs is really hard. And so one of our biggest threats is complacency. Look, and human beings are driven by fear, you know, and apathy. When the world was terrified about Ebola, it took action. When the world was terrified about HIV and AIDS, it took action. Our job is to try and sustain that action without being histrionic, without raising alarm bells, but saying, yes, we can really do this. You know, this is important. But if you stop now, if you turn your back on this, if you stop in investing in this, then we don't get to an end. And actually, the disease probably resurges. So you're not missing anything. And it's a challenge we have, which is, as I say, not raising the alarm bells to points where you have that hysteria, but saying, we ain't finished yet. We must keep going, and we need your support, we need the resources, and we need to use new innovations, new technologies, and the health systems that you talk about to get there.
What role can the media play in helping to get this information out? Talk about the gains that have been made in combating AIDS, talk about the problems that still exist, talking about what's the resources that are out there. How vital is it for the media to get involved in this? And not do puff pieces, but I'm talking about doing good objective analyses of this problem and helping people to better understand it.
Yeah, so I think that's the important part, getting people to understand that. So first is letting people understand where it is and it isn't over, but it can be. Tackling the prejudices of stigma and discrimination, understanding what is HIV, what is AIDS, you know, how do you get it, how do you stop it, what can we do? So there's a range of things there that I think the media can do. My hope is that the media, as it talks about the Sustainable Development Goals, as it talks about all national agendas, thinks about, health broadly. I mean, in health today, demography is playing a role. Populations are aging. The burden of what they call non-communicable diseases, cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, hypertension, are all challenges today. I'm not going to stand up and say AIDS is more important. You must finish AIDS first and then we'll deal with those. We need to find ways of dealing with all of them. And that's driving markets and prices for drugs and therapies. It's strengthening health systems to deliver. It's thinking about not just having siloed approaches to individual diseases, but bringing it together. And the media can play a big role in taking the data and the evidence and showcasing what's working, how it's working, and just continuing to raise that understanding.
It's very important. And the last minute or so we have, I know you've talked about several of the challenging areas, but of all of those, what do you see as the number one challenge, the greatest challenge to you and the people who are working in the anti-AIDS area to help people better understand this problem and to be mobilized and to reduce this horrific disease and eliminate it eventually? Is there one looming challenge that's out there? I know funding is always a problem, but over and above that.
Right, so complacency.
Complacency.
I think people turning to the next issue, the next emergency, the next crisis, and forgetting where we are. So we have to try. We're human beings. We can, what's the expression, walk and chew gum at the same time. We have to do that. So I think one of our biggest threats right now is complacency. What I can guarantee is that as the SDGs and Agenda 2030 has been adopted, we continue to evolve and reform our organization. We have great partnerships with the President's Emergency Plan. We have great partnerships with the Global Fund. We'll continue to work, and they can't deliver without us. So we can help drive the policy, we can help drive the legislation, we can help drive public attitudes, we can help with technical assistance. We know what works. We increasingly know what works and where. We need to ensure that the public are behind us, that government are behind us, that we get the financing we need, and then we will generally get to an end of AIDS.
And it looks very promising. At this point, it looks very, very promising. And a goal of 2030 is doable. It is feasible, it's logical, and it's very probable that we're going to achieve that. But again, as you mentioned, it's going to take a concerted effort, bringing all of the parties together.
Yeah.
excuse me, to make sure everybody is participating, to make sure there's proper funding,
Yeah.
to make sure that the resources are out there, that people have access to the medications and that type of thing. And of course, the UN has played a critical role in this. But Simon Bland, the director of the UNAIDS Office at the UN in New York, it's a very important topic, and I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Great pleasure. Thanks so much, Bill. Thank you.
I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.